Hey everyone, or at least those of you who are here. Uh, Thank you for joining me here for Disgorged Online. If you don't know me, my name is Zach Jabal. I am the wine educator at Tom Douglas Restaurants here in Seattle, and the host and producer of the Vine Pair podcast, and a general wine writer, wine lover, and like the rest of you, trying to figure out what the hell to do with myself in the time of quarantine. I apologize from the outset. They're doing construction next door, so you may hear the sound of someone using a circular saw. Sorry, I'll try and talk loudly to cover it up. Today, we are going to be talking about Rosé, and in particular, Provencal Rosé. We have, at least in my glass, I have the Commanderie de la Bergemont. Sorry, I should have actually memorized the name beforehand. I really want to take this opportunity to talk about Provencal Rosé, French Rosé, and Rosé in general, because at least here in Seattle, we've had some run of nice days, and nothing to me spells the arrival of spring quite like Rosé. And even in this most bizarre of springs, I think there's still time and place to enjoy Rosé and to find some pleasure in what to me is one of the most pleasurable sort of wines that is out there, especially in the sort of straightforward sense. So I'll start with a little bit just talking about the sort of the, I guess for lack of a better word, the point of rosé in my mind. And so rosé is certainly, and especially quality rosé, is something that you don't have to reserve for spring and summer. I know for a lot of us, the initial appeal was definitely sitting outside, in the nicer months, having something cold in your glass, something refreshing, but something that maybe was a little bit more, and had evoked a sense of celebration in the way that rosé does, I think, for a lot of us. But certainly a wine that can be versatile in terms of its use at the table or in restaurants when those are open, with a lot of different cuisines. Actually, I'm making some Indian food tonight, so my wife and I will be having this with dinner. And so, like I said, really versatile wine, because rosé kind of sits at this midpoint between white and red. You can, I think, a lot of times find utility with it in places that you would maybe look to either white or red wine in certain circumstances. Like I said, great to have as a part of your collection kind of year round. But obviously, like I said, for me, this time of year is when I start to really feel the need for rosé. And so I wanted to start a little bit by focusing in on the specific place where this comes from, the region of Provence in the southeastern part of France. Provence is kind of a special place for winemaking for a few reasons. First of all, it's a place where the sort of romance of the wine is very obvious. It's a beautiful country. You're on the Mediterranean. It's very hot, especially during the summer, but kind of nice year round. And it has Provence and Marseille and Nice and all those places have kind of always evoked for not just Americans, for everyone, including the French, a sense of a sort of kind of that kind of Riviera lifestyle, right? Sunshine, warm days, you're by the ocean, you're by the pool, you're drinking wine. And so rosé to the French has always carried that kind of cachet, but it's only relatively recently in the last decade or so, maybe a little more, that it's become a beverage that people here in the United States take seriously. I'm a little too young to be of a sort of White Zinfandel era. When I got started in wine, White Zinfandel was already kind of considered long since past the point when people took it seriously. But this was also before the sort of rosé revival that happened, like I said, in the last decade and really in the last 5 or so years. And so it's really been cool to see because there's a lot of great rosé out there. It's, like I said, a super versatile wine and should be taken seriously. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about sort of the French approach to wine classification, just to kind of ground us in understanding what some of the words we're going to see on labels mean. But before I get into that, I do want to mention, if you guys do have questions or comments or anything you want to share, please feel free to drop that in the comment thread there. I should be on the right-hand side of the screen for you guys. And I'd be happy to answer questions about this or whatever else in the world of wine. Totally fine. So France and most, or actually all wine-producing countries in the EU now have a fairly standardized system of appellations which are there are basically three tiers of wine. There's sort of the what is generally like the sort of vin de France, meaning wine from France, and that appellation can literally just mean the grapes were grown in France. And then there is the IGT, or Indication Géographique Typicale, I believe, and that is describes a much larger or describes a smaller geographic area than all of France, but can encompass some pretty wide regions, and also allows for a lot of winemaking styles, techniques, and or varieties that may not be traditional for the region. And then there is the Appellation d'Origine Protégée, or AOP system, which used to be called the AOC system because Protégé used to be Contrôlé. EU standardized language, a little more not that interesting. And so those describe most of the wine appellations that we would be familiar with in France. So everything from Sancerre to Margaux to Champagne. And so with this wine here, we are dealing with the Côte d'Aix-en-Provence, which is one of the smaller appellations within the broader Côte de Provence appellation. And those appellations actually cover white, rosé, and red wine. All three are made in the Provence region, even if for most of us, rosé is the thing that we associate with Provence and the thing we probably consume that carries that appellation. A couple things to make note of. So the principal varieties in Provençal rosé are typically Grenache, first and foremost, and then some of the other common blending partners for Grenache. So Mourvèdre, Syrah, Cinsault, Cunoise, and a few others out there. And we got a question about the bottle. I will hold it up here for just a moment while I talk. So in addition to those, some of the appellations, although not this specific one, do allow for the use of some white grapes. The thing that's interesting to note, and one of the reasons I think why Provençal Rosé in particular has caught on and become, in a lot of cases, the sort of standard bearer for really high quality rosé, is that there's always been an emphasis on dry wine. So as I was mentioning, like I said, I'm a little too young to remember the white Zinfandel craze, but that was obviously sort of the first wave of interest in pink wine in the U.S. in particular. And part of the appeal with white Zinfandel was that it was sweet. And rosés from France mostly have been made traditionally dry, but in particular from Provence, the approach has always been to ferment the wines to near total dryness, meaning very little or no residual sugar. And this appellation and most of the other ones has a pretty stringent maximum in terms of residual sugar. In the case of Côte d'Aix-en-Provence, it's 4 grams per liter, which is dry for sure. And many of them have essentially no residual sugar in them. So that characteristic, that contrast to the sort of sweet, cloying white Zinfandel style of rosé that some people were familiar with when rosé kind of reemerged, provided this easy point to say, oh, okay, maybe you didn't like rosé when it was white Zinfandel. You didn't like pink wine when it was white Zinfandel, or things in that style. Here's something very different. These wines are not, for one, I mean, if any of you have this wine or wine like it, you'll notice even calling it rosé is kind of, it feels a little bit of a misnomer. I mean, this is like maybe a pale salmon color, like a very light copper. I mean, it could be just a sort of fairly colored white wine if you weren't looking very closely. And so that pale color combined with the really dry quality has been something that has been come to define Provençal Rosé. And then because of its success and its reputation has then come to kind of dominate what a lot of people are doing with rosé these days. There are still people making, sweeter styles of rosé. There are people making really deep pigmented, sort of almost red wine-esque rosés too, to be sure. But this is a lot of what people are looking for and a lot of what people are making. Speaking of making rosé, I just wanted to point out there are kind of 2 main ways to do it. So the first method is what's called saigner, which is the French term for bleeding. It's spelled S-A-I-G-N-E-E. And the saigner method is really useful for producers of principally red wine. And actually, to answer Renee's question, so my understanding is that the earliest white Zinfandel, which was Beringer, was actually basically the result of an accident. They had a stuck fermentation, and I think, or there was some issue during the early stage of the production, and they basically ended up with this sort of like a pink in color, not fully fermented wine. And because at the time they didn't necessarily want to just pitch wine and throw it out, basically, they decided to bottle it and see if they could sell it. And and that ended up being super popular. Beringer sold all of it and then started making that wine intentionally. I think probably my guess is that their Rosé or their White Zinfandels were made in the Sanier method, which I was just about to describe, because that's much more cost effective. I don't think they were growing grapes for Rosé or for White Zinfandel, and I'll get to that right now. So as I was saying, the Sanier method involves what's called bleeding off of wine. So if you're making red wine, let's say you're making a wine that's made, from Grenache, Syrah, Mourvedre. So what you might do if you want to make some rosé is early in the fermentation process, and I mean like 12 to 24 hours in, or maybe even earlier, after you've harvested your grapes, you've crushed them, and they're starting to ferment, and some of the pigment compounds are being extracted from the skins of the grapes into the juice. You take away some of that, maybe 10 to 20% of the liquid, and that goes to be turned into rosé. So it picks up some color, and it's obviously still got sugar in it, so it's going to ferment fully. And the what's left behind is what becomes the red wine. And the advantage to a red wine maker in doing that is it allows you to make a more concentrated red wine. And this Sanier method had been used for red wine for a long time, and has now more recently, as rosés become more popular, more and more producers who were maybe doing Sanier have decided, well, we should not just pour that down the drain. We should turn that into rosé and we can sell it. There's some really good rosé made through the Sanier method. I will say that in my opinion, and it is a considered one, there is the principal downside to the Sanier method is that in the end, you are dealing with grapes that were really grown for red wine first. And as I'll talk about when we get to sort of the way of looking at these wines, the best wines are usually rosés are going to be made from grapes that were grown with the intention of making rosé first and foremost. And that has to do with the selection of which varieties you're growing. It has to do with where you're growing the grapes, how ripe you're letting them get, because the flavor profile of the wine will change. And even if you bleed off a little bit of that juice and you make the wine really dry and it's got some nice crispness to it, the reality is you're working with fully ripe red grapes, and they're just going to have a different flavor profile, a different level of alcohol, and a different level of acid than grapes that you are growing for rosé. And so that's the other way to do it is you have specific vineyard rows, blocks, whole vineyards, whole regions potentially set aside to make rosé. And that means that maybe you're working with different varieties, as I mentioned. You might be working because with grapes that you're growing for rosé, you're looking to pick the grapes at a much less ripe level than you would for red wine, because you're wanting something that in terms of the acidity and the weight is going to be more like white wine than like red wine typically. And you're looking for often freshness as well, which isn't necessarily something you're looking for in most red wines. And so you're in choosing to where you plant, you might plant some of your grapes or your vines for rosé in cooler sites. You might plant them at sites that are a little bit more exposed to the elements higher up. Or maybe as opposed to red grapes, which in the Northern Hemisphere will usually have some sort of southern exposure to the vineyard. These might be planted at more of an east or west or even northern exposure, depending on where you are and how hot it is. And then it's the case that in Provence and in the regions in the Côte de Provence or the hills of Provence, the best vineyards are usually situated relatively high up. That there is the higher the elevation, the better the grapes for rosé that come from there, because they don't actually get as ripe. They can stay on the vine for longer and develop more flavor without reaching a level of sugar and a lower level of acid that would make the wine not the sort of delicious, crisp, refreshing style that we are familiar with and that we like, and it would make it something a little bit not White Zinfandel, but heading slowly in that general direction. Like I said, that one of the challenges with Provençal Rosé is dealing with heat and dealing with ripeness. And so, whereas a lot of France, not all of France, but a lot of France is generally speaking cooler, and getting your grapes fully ripe, especially red grapes, is a bit of a challenge. Provence is kind of the opposite. That we're there, especially when they're looking at making rosé, the goal is really to slow down the ripening process as much as you can, and that way you are not having to pick the grapes really, really early, because, and I'll avoid a too deep dive on this, but basically when you're looking at growing grapes, you're looking at and deciding when to pick the grapes, you're looking at this sort of these multiple sort of factors. You're looking at the sugar levels in the grapes, which is a really kind of crude measure, but very important to understand because the more sugar there is in the grape, the more alcohol there will be in the finished wine. And just higher sugar levels denote ripeness in a very crude sense. I mean, we think about ripe fruit as being sweet fruit. So the more sugar there is, the riper it is. You're also looking at acidity, and acidity diminishes as the fruit ripens and matures. And so you're looking to find a sort of intersection point where there is still enough acidity to maintain the sort of freshness and balance in the wine with enough sugar to make a wine of sufficient strength. And these days, that's less of a concern than maybe it used to be, because we don't need necessarily to worry about ripeness as much. It's just generally easier to get grapes ripe, both because of climate change, but also because we know more about how to grow them. We have better techniques and better understanding of which varieties and clones to plant where. And then with red grapes, you're looking at other characteristics, which are there in white too, but we think about it more in terms of red, like tannins and other and pigment. And we're looking to get a kind of midpoint of all those things, an intersection on a sort of imaginary or mental graph. And then we're looking, the grape growers and winemakers are looking to pick at that point. And so what planting these grapes for rosé, or these vines for rosé, does in these sort of elevated places, these cooler places, is it slows that all down. So you have less pressure as you get near ripening to hit that exact moment. I mean, basically what grape growers and winemakers would love would be as much buffer as possible, so that if they, if there are considerations that go into this, because some of it's just like labor, like if your picking crew isn't available that day and your grapes got riper than you wanted, well, you're kind of stuck. And that can be an issue with grape growing in general. And so with rosé, it's especially important because sometimes you're really dealing with relatively fine margins where a day or two late and you're going to produce a wine that's, a 0.5% or a whole percent more alcoholic. It's going to have less acid and maybe less enjoyable. All right. There's a lot of talk about rosé in the abstract. Let's taste. I'm sure if those of you who are drinking along with have already tried, please do. If you're drinking something else, some other Provencal rosé, and you want to type what you might be having, let me know. I'd be curious to see. But something that's going to be kind of a characteristic of all of these, and I will say before I get into this anymore, there's absolutely nothing wrong. I mean, you read people who say, "Oh, don't have your rosé right out of the fridge." I mean, are you going to get every last bit of nuance in the wine if you drink it ice cold? No, but so what? That's okay. Rosé is not a wine that you have to take seriously to enjoy. It can be just a refreshing kind of something to sip, whether that's something you want to think about or not. And then, but at the same time, if you do want to kind of get a little bit more of the character of the wine, I would, serve it cold, but not ice cold, not straight out of the refrigerator. You can let it warm up a little bit or warm up in your glass. You'll notice I'm using a relatively large, this is a red wine glass because that's what I prefer to drink out of in general, for white or rosé, as well as red wine, obviously. So as I mentioned, one thing that's pretty common for all these is that there is a real kind of pale pink. I mean, again, like I said, for me with this specific wine, it would be a bit of a stretch to even label it as pink. Frankly, like I said, pale salmon, really light copper, those kinds of colors are really more accurate. But on the nose, you definitely get this sort of very classic Provencal nose. So there's a hint of the sort of what we talk about as the sort of classic garrigue or flavors and herbs of the region. So you think about the south of France, you think about all the things that are present there that grow there wildly. I mean, lavender is one that's often referred to. I would say that getting the floral notes on this is a little tricky when it's still pretty cold. As it warms up, it might be a little more evident. But definitely things like sage, rosemary. There's a real fennel note to this particular wine to me as well, which I find really appealing. I tend to like those kind of like sweet green herb notes in my rosé, especially from this kind of place. And then on the palate, so we've got, again, the first thing that I always notice with these wines is like the perception of fruit is very, it's very subtle. It's not that in your face. I mean, again, this is part of what appeals to people about this style of rosé is they're not driven by a whole lot of fruit character. And you get a lot more of that sort of herbal note, and you get a lot of the sort of I guess I would describe it as sort of like there's kind of like a irony, kind of like a like a metallic, but not in an unpleasant way, just kind of a metallic character to the wine. All right, I am going to answer a couple questions here. Okay, so Michelle said, are the lighter colored rosés more flavorful? Hard to say. I think one of the challenges with rosé these days is that actually trying to judge the wine based on its color can be really misleading. I think that some of these I really like kind of lighter colored rosés can definitely have a lot of flavor. They can be more intense, but sometimes you'd be surprised that a really dark rosé can actually also be very can have a lot going on. It can be, I think a lot of people tend to think that the darker, more sort of like kind of pinkish or even into that reddish hued color rosé is going to be sweeter because, again, there's that sort of white Zinfandel precedent. I think some of them are going to be actually can be quite good. There are some, depending on the variety that it's made from, like I've had some really good rosés made from Sangiovese from Tuscany, and those can be pretty dark in color, but actually relatively restrained. So I would say, shopping by color is always a little tricky. I think it's safer bet is to look at really established appellations like the appellations in Provence as a generally pretty good bet. There are unfortunately bad rosés out there, but if you are in a decent enough place, even in a grocery store, let alone a wine shop, and you see a bottle like this bottle, which was about $20, you see a $20 bottle of rosé from Provence, the odds are it's going to be at least pretty good, and it's going to be, generally speaking, in this style. May not be exactly like this. They vary because they use different varieties, that there are different sort of techniques, but generally speaking, it's going to be like this. Okay, what else are people drinking? Mike's having Merlot. Hey man, I love Merlot. That's cool. We'll be getting to that eventually, I'm sure. And let's see, Languedoc and Beaujolais. Well, at least you guys are in France. I mean, Languedoc's right next door, so that's pretty close. Cheers. I want to talk about two other things really quick here before we wrap things up. So one of them is, as I was mentioning at the beginning, there's a lot of great pairings that they go with rosé, or I should say rosé goes really well with a lot of different foods. It's super versatile. That's one of the many reasons why it's become so beloved. But I will say I'm not always a huge advocate for like, oh, you have to, that we have to kind of pay too much homage to classic pairings and things from the same region. But I will say that one of the really great pairings that exists with rosé is with bouillabaisse, which is a super classic dish from the sort of that Provencal area. And if you think about it, it's basically a fish stew made with tomatoes. You have this sort of tart, refreshing herbal rosé. It's just super delicious. And since all of us have a little bit of time, I think, on our hands, making a really good bouillabaisse could be something that could be fun to do. As I said, I made Indian food today, so, I didn't follow my own instructions, but that's okay. The last thing I wanted to touch on, and obviously, like I said, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to pass them along. The last thing I will say, though, is an important thing I think to talk about, too, when it comes to rosé, is to talk about how I think rosé is really fascinating because it managed to do something that I don't know that I thought would have been possible, which is it escaped a really unfortunate gender stereotype. Rosé was thought of as a drink for women, for a really long time. And that was not just here in the US, that was kind of internationally. And I think it's really cool that rosé has come to be a drink that it's still, if you look at the demographics in terms of who buys what, it still skews towards women, but not nearly as extremely as it used to, or as much as you would think. It's about 60-40, which is pretty solid. I mean, that's a pretty even balance if you don't think that or if it's a pretty good balance given the fact that it's pink wine and it had that association for a long time. And so I think that's really cool. I think rosé is one of those beverages that should not have a gender stereotype. I mean, I don't think any should have a gender stereotype attached to them, but certainly rosé is something that everyone can find something to love about. And I'm a huge fan. It's funny, in preparing to do this, I was actually really excited. Oh, I have one more point, but I'll finish this one here real quick. So I was really excited to do this because like I said, that drinking rosé is always this thing that to me is it feels it's a wine that transports and it can take you to I guess a sort of sunny beach on the Riviera. And while none of us can do that now in real life, it's nice to be able to do that with a bottle. I would also say this is 2018, and I will say that with these wines, the Provencal rosés and other really high quality rosés, I actually find that they're better with about a year and a half of age on them. These are serious wines, and if you drink them really young, even though that's become, the trend is everyone wants kind of the fresh rosé, although this year is going to be its own weird situation. But generally speaking, you'd be seeing more and more 2019 rosés on the shelves. You would be seeing a lot of this is getting pushed, and the 2018s would be sort of cleared out or on closeout or whatever. And if you see them on closeout in a store or you or whatever, grab them, because really they do take some time to really reach their full level of maturity to develop more of those sort of herbal and even kind of possibly meaty notes that can be really pleasant. Let's see here. Question: how does it hold up if you open it one night, don't drink all of it? I think rosé does kind of how things roll, especially these days. But if I somehow, by some strange twist of fate, we don't, I would definitely be able to drink it tomorrow. And it's also you can, if need be, you can always cook with it. I think rosé can be a fun. We think about white wine and or even red wine, depending on the dish you're making. But I love to sometimes use rosé if I have a little bit left over that I don't feel like drinking or it's been open for a few days. It can work really nicely in a lot of places that you might use a white wine as a, to finish a dish, to deglaze a pan, to even add to a soup or something like that. It can work really nicely as well. I wanted to say, if there are any last questions, we're on here for another minute or two. I think I'm still finalizing. I think probably on Saturday we're gonna. I'm still debating. So actually, if you guys have thoughts, you want to send them to me either on the YouTube channel or the other various ways you have to get a hold of me. I was thinking about doing. We can do. Sort of a cooked Rhone red, so a classic Rhone blonde. It's a little similar in region to this, but something that most people probably can get their hands on pretty easily. I was also thinking about New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc if we want to stay kind of light and fresh. Or if you want either of those or anything else, drop me a line. You know how to get a hold of me. And thanks so much for joining in. I hope everyone is doing the best they can. Obviously, stay safe, be well, and I hope to see you back on Saturday. Thanks.